Hi, I'm McGreg's, and this is my 1973 single car detached garage. When me and my wife purchased this property, I initially had the intention of using this garage to renovate the house because it is all original and we'd like to modernize it, add some sweat equity to our homes as many would like to. But unfortunately, over the last couple years that we've owned it, life has kind of gotten in the way. Work, hobbies, friends, work, you know, things of that nature. So over the time, acquired some tools, built some things, but my garage slowly started to turn into what a lot of other people's garages turn into: storage for, unwanted things, but you don't want to throw them out, unsightly things, dumping ground. And yeah, it kind of turned into, uh, well, you'll see. So, as you can see, this is pretty bad. There's quite a bit of clutter. It's difficult to walk through the shop without having to dodge random tools. So, my game plan here is to start moving everything out of the shop and sorting things into two groups: things to keep and things to toss. Now, I've wanted a shop of my own since I was a little kid because I love cars and always wanted to build custom projects. So you can imagine how stoked I was when I found a shop that I could call my own, and it even came with a house included. Unfortunately, that house is in need of some dire TLC. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So, this is the kitchen, and our house is all original from what we can tell. Pretty old stuff, some rotting wood, as you can see here. It's seen better days, I'm sure. So you can imagine that to keep my wife happy, this will need to take a priority over building a six sleeper in the garage or a 4x4 that's capable of driving up trees. As much as I would love to commit to those projects, the house is going to need to take priority for the time being. Now, don't get me wrong, we have really appreciated having our own space. Moving away from neighbors above us, below us, beside us has been a breath of fresh air, but doesn't change the fact that there's always room for improvements. And speaking of improvements, look at who got their garage cleaned up as you were watching the B-roll footage of the house. Now, while I do have the garage cleaned up pretty decently, we could still make some more improvements. Starting with this bench right here, it really doesn't offer the width that makes a usable space, and I think a miter saw would go well in the area. So let's rip that out. And in classic fashion, as you start ripping things off, you realize you're only probably going to be here once, so I figured it would be a good time to take everything off of my tool wall and give the wall a fresh coat of paint. I think some white would really brighten up the area and give it a fresh look for a fairly cheap amount of money. And that really is the motive behind everything I'm doing here. Basically, how big of an improvement can we make with the least amount of money? And I'm not trying to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on my garage to turn it into some magnificent space, especially if I'm considering moving in the next couple years. So, with that in mind, I picked up the cheapest paint I possibly could from my big box store and decided to get to it. I think this paint was $25, maybe $30, but it's gonna suit its purpose for our needs in this one. Now, don't get me wrong, I would love to sink tons of time and money into this shop and turn it into a fantastic workspace, but I am Scottish, and for the unaware, that means I'm cheap. And I really don't see this shop as being worth it. It's an unheated 16 by 24-foot garage. It's a limited space to begin with, and don't get me wrong, I love having it. I know there are people out there doing amazing things with less, but I would like to add as much value to this house as I can and ideally sell it to start working on the next one. So the idea of pouring a load of cash into this space that won't come with a return on investment doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Plus, I don't see this space as needing major improvements to achieve its purpose. With that in mind, I can't predict the future and I may end up living here for a while after the renovations are complete. So I'm trying to strike a nice middle ground between making improvements to the productive efficiency of the shop while keeping costs in mind, all while avoiding making any decisions that will seriously limit the future options I have in terms of projects that I want to take on. I enjoy woodworking, but as I mentioned previously, I don't want to turn this garage into a space that I'm afraid to do anything messy in. It's a shop at the end of the day. It needs to be multi purpose. Plus, it seems silly to me to have a garage but refuse to use it for anything except woodworking because it's only set up for a single specialty and you want to avoid getting anything dirty. I'm not saying that a shop can't be set up that way, and I would love to have a garage one day with multiple bays, each set up for unique tasks like metalworking, woodworking, painting and finish, what have you. But at this stage in my life, this single space is gonna have to make do for my own needs as well as the needs of my family. So, with that, the garage is now painted. I know it's still pretty messy in here, but we're going to start cleaning that up now. It's one of those things where you kind of have to break a few eggs in order to make an omelet. Now, initially, I didn't think that painting the walls white would make that big of a difference, but I will say I am pretty happy with the improvement. It does make the space a lot cleaner, a lot brighter in appearance, makes the space a lot more welcoming, and I think that's important. If you have a space that you genuinely enjoy being inside of, one that you want to go to, I think the odds of you getting inside of that space and actually making something happen on a frequent basis is a lot more likely, and I think that's important. And so now that the painting is done and there's been some relative cleanup, I've decided I'm going to start laying out where the miter station's going to go. So this starts with some basic measurements to make sure that nothing's impeding itself. I can't have the door swinging open into the miter station itself. So I've decided the simplest and easiest way to do this to get a good visual idea is to just put down some painter's tape, label it, get a good idea of where things are going to be if I decide to build them to those dimensions before committing to it with actual lumber. And following this theme of doing things relatively cheap but trying to maintain quality, I've decided that I'm going to be building this entire miter station out of 2x4s and melamine. It's relatively available, relatively cheap. Well, basically the cheapest material that you can get, I think, at least the 2x4 is. There may be cheaper options than melamine to complete the tabletop, but I think that this is about as cheap as it can get. So I'm just cutting some of that up on the miter saw, getting it to the dimensions that I have in mind, and bringing them over to the floor. The previous painter's tape marks that I laid out to get an idea of what I think about the space as it starts to come together. Make sure that it's going to leave me enough room for future expansion if I so choose, but not be too small that I'm essentially wasting time and materials building it in the first place. So my idea for this miter station is to build it similar to a wall where I'm just going to put studs in every about 9 to 12 inches, so a little tighter than a standard wall, but I want to make sure that I'm going to have enough support and structure here to seriously put some weight on it without ever having to be concerned. And with the material itself being so cheap, I don't want to have a table that's going to end up falling over on me or a workbench that isn't usable. So the smaller section in the middle is to the left of the window, which is exactly where I want the miter saw, right on that outlet that you can see there. So it has easy access to power. So with the layout on the floor and a position I'm happy with, I now take things over to the bench and start getting things lined up for their actual assembly. For the assembly of these frames, I've decided that I will just simply clamp them up and go with some deck screws. It's nothing fancy, but it should be nice and sturdy for the long haul. No wood glue is used during this project, and I already had a box of deck screws on hand, so it just made sense to go with something like that for a project like this. Don't get the wrong idea though, just because I want to do this for a reasonable amount of money doesn't mean I want it improper. So here you can see I'm checking for square by measuring corner to corner, making sure everything comes in tight. And I also like to measure across width-wise just to make sure I'm not having any heavy bowing in any given area. I'm sure we've all been to our big box store and seen the immaculately straight lumber that we can get, but it's still good to just double check before we fully commit. And once I'm happy with my dimensions, it's just as simple as measuring out my offsets for my 2x4s and slapping them into place. I will take the time to pre-drill out the holes for these 2x4s. It's always a very frustrating experience when you have everything cut and measured properly and you just end up driving a screw in, splitting your lumber, sending it without really thinking twice. And so, gonna try to avoid that on this project. Now, I could show you the entire process of putting these frames together, but I think you get the picture. It's pretty simple. Drill out your pilot holes, drive 2 deck screws per end of each stretcher, and call it a day. So, here, what you can see is me marking out my studs as I essentially want to hang a ledger board, or it's not really a French cleat, but French cleat-esque style way to keep the backside of this miter station afloat. The front side will hang off of legs, but this seemed like a very easy way, so I simply just cut the ledger board to the same length as my section of miter station top, grabbed my level, got it on top, got it where I liked it, and fastened it to the stud. Once I had my 2 ends fastened, it was as simple as just giving it a double check everywhere and fastening it to every other stud to make sure that it's rock solid. Now here I'm building the legs that will support the front side of the miter station. I decided to go with a very simple design, laminating 2 pieces of 2x4 together using a third piece of 2x4 to offset the lengths. So just kept them clamped together to ensure a nice tight fit, nothing moves on me. Drill 3, 4 holes and drive some deck screws through to ensure that they stay tight together. You'll see how this all comes together in a second. I chose to take an optional step, but you don't need to do this if you're, interested in following this design yourself. And as you can see, this is a quick and simple way to get a proper offset between 2 pieces of 2x4 to make a very simple leg. Now, I decided to take one further step with my leg and essentially rabbet out a portion of it, but if you decide to do something similar, you don't have to. You can simply install them underneath the table as such. I wanted to see my legs to be flush with each end, which as you can see currently, it is not. And as you can also see, this table is the perfect height for all the important work I have planned in the future for myself. Now, regardless if you're building your miter station cheap like I am or doing a much more intricate job with more expensive materials, ensuring that your 2 opposite tables are coplanar and level are very important. You do not want to have a piece of wood going into your miter saw on one level and then exiting your miter saw on a different level, different coplane, what have you. You will ensure that you're setting your future self up for nothing but headaches. So, as the old saying goes, measure twice, cut once. Ensure you do a good job at this stage because if you're anything like me, you're not going to be interested in coming back and redoing this stuff. So, this is the portion of the build that wasn't required, but does add a touch more craftsmanship, in my opinion, by rabbiting away a portion of the leg. I can ensure that the legs fit nice and flush with the very edges of the framing of the table that you'll see here in a moment. Craftsmanship, however, is not the only reason I wanted to take this step. While I do like having fun doing above and beyond things like this. Another aspect is, as you can see, it allows me to scooch the legs out just a little bit more than I otherwise would be able to. And when you're dealing in a shop as small as this, every little bit counts. So I figured we may as well maximize room. At this stage, I am hanging the ledger board that will keep the miter saw itself upright. During this process, I simply used a square to gauge the total height from the floor to the top table of the miter saw, and then ensured that I put the entire thing down about an eighth of an inch, give or take. It is a lot easier to shim your miter saw upwards than it is to grind or sand material downwards. So that is something I would highly recommend that you do as well if you're interested in taking on a project like this. And once that back ledger board is set, it's as easy as rinsing and repeating for the front, simply taking advantage of a couple wood clamps to help me hold my platform in place. Now, one thing I will say is that my shop floor is incredibly unlevel. That is about a 1 inch shim that I created to put under the far side, while the other side requires no shim. I think that most people have an uneven garage floor, so this is something you definitely want to take into account. And like I said earlier, really ensure that everything is square and level, coplanar. If you have one plane that is twisted on a different angle than the other plane, it will come out in terms of the accuracy of your saw, because you are essentially increasing the length of the table of the miter saw several feet, as you do when you make a miter station such as this. So making sure that you get the measurements right, it might be painstaking, but it is absolutely worth it, as it will just be a big bench that doesn't serve the purpose if you don't. The funny thing about me building this miter station here is I really don't have a huge purpose for it. I mean, it probably will come in handy as I do some things, but honestly, it's more of a spot to create a more usable space in general. As I mentioned earlier, that previous bench was about 18 inches wide, and so this is coming in at a pretty healthy width, and it does give me a spot to put a miter saw, so that's nice too. But all in all, in terms of building things that are practical for the house, like cabinets, I mean, I guess I could use it for stretchers, maybe some baseboards here and there. I'm hoping that it surprises me and comes in with more uses than I think it'll actually have, but I don't know. It's just kind of interesting to put the time and effort into something like this without having a major direct purpose, but it should have some indirect purposes, and who knows, maybe it'll surprise me. On the flip side, it does improve the look of the space. I do think it gives me more options to work with wood, so that's nice. And it is something I've wanted to build for a while, so it has been a little bit of fun learning some things while I go. Now, like I said earlier, I planned on building these tabletops out of melamine. Is melamine? Melamine? Either way, that's what I built it out of. Just simply used a simple straight edge with this circular saw to cut it down to width, taking some measurements here for the overall length, and as luck would have it, my lovely assistant had impeccable timing as usual to help me catch the cutoff piece as I cut it down in length. Thank you. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
And similar to my garage floors being completely unlevel, my walls follow a similar pattern where they are not even remotely close to straight. So I decided giving this a little scribe would be an extra touch to not only help look better, but I'm sure future me will thank myself from all the pencils rolling into creaks and cracks and crevices on the backside when I'm actually working on this thing in the future. And with a panel of this size, I decided that taking a jigsaw to the piece would be easier than taking it over to the table saw. So, quick little cut on the scribe line, and it fits just how I want it to. And I simply repeat the process another couple times, and I now have tops for the other two surfaces. The last step of the miter station is to get the miter saw mounted to the station itself in a fashion that leaves it both level and coplanar with the adjacent two tables. So, as I mentioned previously, building this surface in which the miter saw sits on slightly lower allows me to make some shims and jack that height up just right. Now, I will say this process took some time and you're not going to see it all on camera, but by trial and error, you can get your miter saw fairly level. People have recommended to use playing cards, which I think would be great. I had some leftover hard pressed cardboard that I simply cut down into templates and slowly but surely got my miter saw to a position that I'm happy with. It may not be absolutely deadly precise, but table itself isn't made out of cast iron, so I'm happy with where it ended up at. And for my final trick in this garage renovation, I decided to reclaim the lumber from the bench that I pulled out and turn it into a shelf to help get some things off the ground and give myself a usable space. It was easy enough to measure things up, cut them down, try to find the best pieces of lumber. Best pieces of lumber is a stretch. Everything is warped and tattered, old, covered in paint and oils. So it's definitely not going to win any beauty awards. But in terms of practicality, it does serve its purpose. So that's really all I was looking for. Lumber is expensive and I had it on hand. So it just seemed to make sense to put it to work in this instance. Now, the purpose of this bench was pretty simple. I wanted it to store the frequent things that I needed on hand to construct things out of wood. So that would be things like blades, bits, the power tools themselves. It's a little bit of a hybrid between a storage shelf and a power tool station. For the remainder of the items, I did end up making a bench out of a scrap piece of melamine to go underneath the tabletop that I'm currently working on here. I did that off camera, but it's pretty simple to construct. Just a couple 2x4s, once again, on the back wall as a ledger, and that'll hold some of the more long term items that aren't needed on a frequent basis to kind of try to keep the efficiency goal in mind. So, this shelf was a little bit more of an improv build. I didn't draw out a plan or a cut list, just simply took some rough measurements. In terms of hanging the tools, I didn't really love the way that the tools hung from the top. They didn't have a lot of room, so I ultimately decided to hang them upside down as the bottoms of the tool offered quite a bit more of a ridge to grab onto, and I felt like that would be a much more secure way to actually store the tools themselves. These hangers were just made out of some scrap plywood, and I simply just offset them on a tool by tool basis, but they serve their purpose and I'm happy with them. They can also hold a battery while in their storage, which is important because I didn't want to have 5 batteries just floating around the shop. And here we get a nice look at a before and after shot. I think not only in terms of cleanliness, it's a major improvement, but also in terms of function. Tools are much easier to access. The miter saw is not sitting on the floor, which is a huge upgrade. So, all in all, I'm very happy with what was achieved here. I think the space is going to be much more functional than it was prior. Well, hopefully that light behind me isn't destroying this footage. The garage is complete for the time being. It could always be better. It could always be worse, but some of the most important things are we reclaimed some of the space. The shelf behind me is super handy. The miter station is super handy. I can walk around. I have clear hallways or alleyways, whatever you want to call it. I think it's going to be very helpful with the next stages of the projects that I plan on endeavoring into. Renovating the lawn front and back, doing some landscaping, renovate the interior of the home. So plan on making some cabinets in here. Pretty much want to do as much as I can in here while the summer's with me because It's not heated, and I think it's very unlikely that I end up installing a heater into this space. So my goal was to turn this into a practical, usable space with a budget in mind. So I don't think I spent much more than $200 on this miter station in terms of lumber, and that's 200 Canadian dollars, which is like, $20 American. So it should improve efficiency. And I'm sure as I live in it, I will realize more and more things that I'd like to see improvements on, and things that I really don't mind that much. So right now I'm pretty happy with where it's at, and we'll see what kind of changes I want to make for the future. And that may not be in this garage because, well, I mean, the plan is to renovate the house and turn a profit on it. So it's very possible we're not in this house long term. So the guy kind of has to weigh out, does he want to build a miter station out of pure maple and spend quite a bit more money on it? I don't know. All in all, I think that there's really no excuse to not start on another project. So we'll see it in the next video, hopefully. See ya.